Hey everybody, it's your favorite West Virginia on space here, and Amazons. So, they are pretty much a staple of a lot of fantasy and some superhero media, and they occasionally crop up in sci-fi. However, a lot of their logistics doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, I give fantasy and superhero stuff generally a free pass on this because they're dealing with magic that doesn't really have to, or usually doesn't conform to laws in nature. I mean, it doesn't stop them from being dumb, but it, gives them a free pass, basically. But sci-fi usually doesn't have this excuse. Usually at least tries to obey the laws of reality, more or less. Well, obviously with a sci-fi twist and such. But that comes to the question is, why aren't they terribly realistic? Now, I want to preference something at the beginning of this. Generally speaking, they are not necessarily bad to use in a story, though I'm going to rant them out a few times and, point out their flaws and why they don't really make sense. This isn't really a knock in the sense that, you should never use Amazons. It's just being aware of what weaknesses that a society like that would naturally suffer from. And it's not always what you'd immediately expect, I think. Of course, this is, once again, my opinion, of course. And a lot of sci-fi is built around the concept of when a society just breaks for some reason or has an issue. So don't take this so much as a why you should never use Amazons, but just flaws that you either should address in your writing or world building when crafting them, or use these flaws as a method of, helping explore the concept. Also, I should also preface, I'm referring to Amazons here as a society, that is predominantly or exclusively made up of women, and generally speaking, cannot exist as part of a larger social structure. Meaning they can't be like the planet of Amazons and an entire nation that doesn't have this issue. As when you're part of something greater, you can get a lot more leeway with these kind of issues I'm going to point out. But anyway, let's begin. The first issue that immediately crops up is the how and why did it happen? Why would a society of, humans presumably, go from our society, which is made up of both, to predominantly or exclusively be made up of only women, as it is kind of a weird concept. There are a few cheap ways to get around this, but they do have their own problems. A cheap, easy one is that a war killed off all the men, but generally you wouldn't kill off all the men in this situation. And once again, there's no reason by society that would do that would instantly go to having no men. Presumably, they would just wait a few generations and they'd be back to normal. There's been plenty of points in human history where most of the men died out for some reason, but then the population just grew back over a few generations with the survivors. So it's not usually the best idea, although one could extrapolate the concept that maybe they decided a society will shift afterwards. This is somewhat seen in places like Sparta, as an example, where if the men were out fighting a whole lot, those societies have a much higher tendency of, at least back in the day, of being more fair to women, if for no other reason all the men were out warring and dying. So that theoretically could have been the start of it, but like I said, no one exactly calls Sparta a feminist Amazon utopia or anything. So that doesn't quite work. Also, you have to contend that presumably we're going from a society like ours, which is, accepting and generally focused on being equal to all members, to, going ballistic, basically. So that's going to need a good excuse. Another decent thing is, how was it allowed to happen? Presumably there was some existing larger social structure before it, and that's going to be an issue, as naturally wanting to enslave and or kill all men is naturally going to take off pretty much every single man and any woman who cares about the man. So that's going to be over 50% of your population already trying to kill you, which isn't the best start to your society, especially because revolutions often break down to who has more numbers and who has the military. And since in most military careers, with the major exception of piloting, which we'll get to later, is usually dominated by men for one reason or another, so you likely don't have the army on your side. A cheap excuse would be a virus of some type that just kills off all the men, or at least most of them, which actually does kind of work, as it would explain how society could go from ours to being so monogender so quickly. However, during later explanations, this does have its own issues. But of course, the biggest issue we will inevitably suffer from is, why would you stay that way? Disasters and catastrophes or issues of social upheaval can temporarily create that kind of situation, but it does still have issues. So, naturally, I'm not entirely convinced, but all these do kind of work. Although, do expect any kind of Amazon rebellion to be absolutely brutal. Because, either enslaving or outright killing half the population is going to involve a touchy bit of genocide. And quite frankly, a really, really bad one, presumably. But let's move on to another major point that a lot of you are probably screaming at the phone right now. How are the populations growing? Now, this sounds like that is actually a big issue, as naturally humans are designed as a species to, have both male and females. And this is generally how most creatures that have spines work on our planet. Now, theoretically, there are, of course, other arrangements, especially with technology, but you do have to, explain that. Now, a cheap and easy way I've seen a few movies and concepts do it is that women can just reproduce naturally, basically asexually. Now, this reminds me of certain lizards, mainly the New Mexico whippoortail, which does something similar. However, due to genetic bottlenecking issues, all children are basically a clone of their mother, which it does, yes, let you reproduce asexually like that, but it creates the problem that this species would be extremely vulnerable to dying from any kind of disease, since the population would have no way of naturally getting resistant to diseases or improving itself. And it would suffer from issues, mainly that every time a branch of that species is lost, there's no way to make more of them. So any kind of genetic variation will slowly but surely be whittled down until there's only one left, and all it would take is one disease and it's game over. However, of course, the most logical answer in a sci-fi setting is cloning. And cloning does let you get away with a lot, since it would allow you to, of course, clone individuals, but the technology to clone people, at least in a realistic sense, though sci-fi plays around with it a bit, would theoretically allow you to mix around genetics. So you could keep genetic variation, and theoretically raid other places for more DNA when necessary. However, this does come back to the first question, mainly being, why? If you had a situation where all the men died, then presumably your first instinct would just be to clone up more men again, to just fix the issue. So why did they decide not to? Theoretically, that virus could be still going around, but I presume if you have the genetic technology advanced enough to create mass cloning, and then, of course, alter them to keep genetic bottlenecking issues aside, you could probably fix up a cure to the virus with enough time, or have some way of making people resistant. So, this does still imply a societal shift to outright keep men out or enslave them. So, once again, you can't just say, a virus wiped out all the men, and leave it at that in this situation. So all of this does actually work, however. And let me specify that. I mean that for a story and a setting does work. This would allow you to, of course, keep the cloning going and keep the people coming. So you would have a stable gender population. However, this isn't without downsides. So let's get into that. One of the biggest issues of relying on cloning to such a mass degree in a society like this, though this theoretically happens to any society that isn't capable of natural birth in this setting, is that fundamentally you become reliant on the cloning vats in a way that most other societies that have cloning or that kind of technology wouldn't. Because in most sci-fi societies that have cloning, you still have people who can naturally give birth. And this would naturally very hardly change how society functions. You see, in most of human history, people have just been able to assume that your population is going to grow, that people are going to reproduce and make more of themselves. This is just a natural phenomenon. If I'm the ruler of a kingdom that has 10,000 people in it, I can expect those 10,000 people will slowly but surely pair off and create more of themselves, usually in a growth-like fashion. So, but they will have this option because a society of all women is just not going to naturally produce any offspring in most cases. So, you're going to have to rely on the cloning vats, which become a massive source of everything in your society. If the cloning vats fail for whatever reason, then your society doesn't produce offspring. And depending on how long it takes to get these vats going again, that could be a lot. Now, how critical the situation is depends on how expensive and hard it is to make cloning vats. If you're relying on some ancient forerunner technology that you don't know how to build anymore and only exists in one spot, then you're in really bad trouble. But presumably, it's not quite that bad for you. However, that means any site of cloning facilities is going to be a nightmare, because any foe you may develop will naturally target these locations. And if something were to once again cause the cloning vats to break down for any reason, then you don't have population growth anymore. So if the cloning vats stop functioning, whether on a planet or system-wide, it could literally put your species on a timer until natural aging would kill you all off, or you can get the cloning vats working. And this could be a problem. Depending on how it's used, you could be relying on certain materials to make clothing, certain elements, certain times of the year, certain bits or whatever, or massive power consumption or anything. So if any of those things dry up, you run into the same issue. And like I mentioned previously, any society you would have any problem with could target these locations and either destroy them or hold them hostage as basically a way of bribing you into doing whatever you want. After all, if they have all your cloning facilities, then your species is effectively on a timer. So that would make them a natural target. I would suspect if I was going to be smart about this, I'd put any cloning vats I have in heavily defended locations to basically make it impossible, or at the very least you'd already lose by the time you lose the cloning vats. But that does paint a bigger target on those locations regardless. So that is not the best solution, but it is at least a solution that works. Though expect any enemy force to once again target these locations relentlessly, as even minor damage to the system would severely hurt your population growth, why there just isn't that weakness in most other societies. But that does get to the next point. External and internal threats. This may seem slightly obvious to some or never occurred to others, but a society that presumably hates men or at least keeps them in low status wouldn't have good relations with any society that likely doesn't hold this opinion. After all, if we're presuming this is some kind of breakaway from modern humanity, assuming that all of humanity didn't go down this route, any other nations or cultures that didn't do this are probably going to hate you. I mean, just statistically, by pure probability, about 50% of their leadership, their population, or anything is going to be opposed to you on the grounds of not wanting to be a slave or not wanting to die. So, logically, this does hurt. That means that any nation would have a good reason to hate you, and you probably have a good reason to hate them because, they're having the filthy men. So that means your diplomacy is going to be limited. Now, of course, as real-world history shows us, people are willing to put aside a lot of their differences in the name of finding someone they hate more. So, once again, this isn't like you would have no diplomacy options, but it would severely hurt you. Because, once again, you kind of want all of them to die. So, it's going to be a tricky relation, to let's say the least. Also, that comes into the next threat beyond external threats you may suffer from. The next major threat is actually internal. Because once again, I've danced around the concept of whether men in this hypothetical Amazon society are slaves or just killed off or whatever. But whether you enslave them, mind staple them, kill them or whatever, that's going to create issues. If you ever expand or have refugees or anything like that, you're going to run into this problem of what to do with the men. And once again, societies aren't perfectly static. Or at the very least, a society that looks static has to be strong enough to stand up against the bashing force of change. So you might get internal issues. Society's major stuff would be obvious ones, like wanting to change the treatment of men might be kind of obvious. After all, if you are saying we want to kill all men, then another rebel faction might say, oh, we just want to enslave them, or vice versa. Or people might get, the idea that maybe equality was a good idea and break off and try to fight you over equality. All these things could be massive hindrances. And once again, in a society, whoever can close the cloning vats basically controls the game. As once again, if you control all or most of the cloning vats, you can basically wait anyone out. So I suspect in this society, rather than be a bunch of nature hippies, they would likely be authoritarian in order to keep the cloning vats running, and whoever does hold the cloning vats, political parties, organizations, or noble families, is likely to have a lot of power simply because they could deny you children and just wait you out. So, yeah. Once again, all these issues will combine to make an Amazon society highly unstable. Oh, and in case you're curious, most of these issues, if not all of them, would also apply to an all-male society. Although I would suspect the all-male society would burn out a lot faster. That's just my personal opinion, though. But ultimately, a lot of this applies both. But I think we all kind of agree that all-male societies are a horrible idea. But we do seem to have this idea that all-female societies wouldn't be as bad. Although in my opinion, it would just last longer before we all die. But ultimately, that's just my opinion. All this isn't to say you can't make some good stories with sci-fi Amazon. Like I said, it's mostly you need to be aware of the weaknesses that such a society would face, issues and critical things that would happen. Societies are not built to be they are built to try to be perfect usually. But fundamentally, no society we ever created was perfect or had no flaws. And in storytelling, a group who is perfect and has no weaknesses isn't good for storytelling. So it doesn't mean you can't tell a story here. Just, once again, be aware of how the society will be affected, what they would need to do to survive, and what would be their weaknesses, and what would be their internal struggles. But anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time. Yeah. Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscribble. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.